So I'm a computer scientist. So we'll clarify that. I'm not a social scientist. So Urban Star, why? Oh, because I'll present a couple of works. One is called Urban Opticon, and the other Urban Gems. So I thought a good summary would be Urban Star, right? So who am I? That's my name, Daniele. So obviously it's finally not because I'm a female, but because I come from Italy. And my context of study is cities, right? Why? Well, because urbanization also for computer scientists is important. If you think about half of the population, more than half of the population nowadays lives in cities. By 2050, we're going to have more than 70%. So when we design technologies or new applications, then we need to factor urbanization in our design. And therefore, we need research how to factor that in, right? And most of my research has been around studying psychological perception of cities. So when you are in the built environment or when you are in a certain neighborhood, how do you feel? What are the psychological perception of it? And when we started in a very quantitative way, and as some people in the room, we started to analyze the Oyster card data, so you know what it is, right? You too. Most of you are in UK, so I assume that, how many people use the Oyster card? Use. Oh, a lot of people, fantastic. So it's basically a passive RFID. If you scratch it, I don't know if you did it, but if you scratch it, then you can find that. And that means that basically when you type in, it's register that you're entering a station. When you type out, you're exiting the station. Now, if you collectively take the data, you can actually study the flow of people. And that's what we did for a month. So for a month, we studied the flow of data, typing in and typing out, and we studied a graph of the London Underground, where you had nodes, the subway stations, and the flow of people going from one subway station and the others, and we studied some specific metrics that are related to centrality or betweenness in a network. But if I were to summarize really quickly, the main finding is this one. This is science at best. So not really. But so what we found is that people who live in deprived areas, they go to other deprived areas and they go to well-off areas. People who live in well-off areas, what do? They go to other well-off areas, right? So that's the obvious thing we found. And one sociologist, how many sociologists we have in the room? Oh, wow. Cool. Welcome, guys. So one sociologist at BBC Radio said, oh, that's obvious, right? We've been knowing that for 30 years. But he considered that we've been knowing that now from different data sources, real time, and different temporal and geographic resolutions. But what we know is that the concept of visibility, right? So this is well known, most of you might know that. And the idea is that well-off areas, they tend to be much more exposed than deprived areas. And then they take to stick in people's mind. First guy, Kevin Lynch. Some of you, especially the urban planners, architects in the room, have read this book, 1970. He tried to study different city forms and tried to relate that to the well-being of city residents. How does he define visibility? In a very, very easy way. So if you can organize in a coherent pattern different parts of the city, then that part of the city tends to be visible. How that relates to well-being, though, it's a bit more complicated. So just let me give you an example. The idea is that if you were to leave, I was speaking with someone yesterday night, and I gave this example. Just imagine you have a house, and from your house, you get out, and you are in a maze, right? So you don't find your way. So every day you have to walk through. How expensive in cognitive terms is that walking through, right, a maze? Now think about another situation where you were to live in a very distinctive parts of the city, easy navigable, so you take always the same route. Sometimes you can change, and that's easy to do, right? So in terms of mental effort, it's easy. So there is a relationship between city forms and well-being. Have you been following me? Okay, fantastic. So there is this relationship. Kevin Lynch, 1970s, started to hypothesize that. But the first quantitative study between this relationship between well-being and city forms is that of Milkrun. How many people know Milkrun? Tons of you. Most of the computer scientists know him because of the 6-degree experiment. But he did other experiments, and one thing that he did is how can I quantify the visibility, right? I gave you the definition before, but it's very difficult to quantify that. So what he did a very simple experiment, and he said, okay, a good proxy for visibility is recognizability. Right? So what he did is that he had his students in front of him in New York back then, and they showed them for 90 minutes different pictures of New York. And the student had to recognize where the pictures were taken. So after collecting all the answers from his students and measuring the fractional correct answers from his students, he could actually draw the recognizability map of New York. Right? This is from the original paper. And somehow he showed that well-to-do areas tend to be more recognizable than less well-to-do areas. So this was the first work that was trying to understanding the relationship between well-being and, let's say, recognizability, right, of the urban environment. Now, since then, there has not been any work on this quantitative relationship, surprisingly enough, mainly because it's difficult to do and lab experiments have their shortcomings. But one of the interesting differences between the 70s and nowadays is we have the web, we have the internet, right? And as computer scientists, we are actually very happy to use it, and we have the tools to do that, and also we could go beyond the lab experiments, and we did a website. It's called urbanopticon.org. It's up, the new version right now. If you go in there, the old version looked like that. So it's very simple. So we copy Milkrun experiment into the web. Now, I'm simplifying that. It's not entirely that way, so you have a lot of tricks to do. But it is very simple. You get to show 10 pictures from Google Street View in London, and you have to guess the closest tube station or borough, or you can say simply, I don't know. And then, based on the correct answers, you can draw the recognizability map of London, as Milkrun did. As simple as that. Now, what's the difference? Well, instead of sitting in a classroom for 90 minutes, being subject to the experiment of your professor, it's 1 minute game with a purpose. So you just spend 1 minute, you share your score on Facebook, on Twitter, and that's it. So also the other advantage is that you can stratify the data in all sorts of ways, in unprecedented ways. So in a few months you can have we had more than 2,000 players. And just to give you a really simple example of that, that is the pink is the politically decided boroughs boroughs of London. And on the right, you have the cartogram that is distorted depending on the recognizability scores. And you can clearly see the central part of London is much more recognizable than other parts. And in terms of collective maps, the south totally disappears. And as I was telling you, also the cool thing of this is that you can stratify the data by, for example, where people are taken, where people are connecting from, right? From the IP addresses, you can get to a certain extent their cities. So you know what is recognizable for people inside London, for people outside London and outside UK. So you can see that the recognizability of different 5 regions of London doesn't change very much. The ranking doesn't change, but the location might change. So let me give you a couple of examples. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and you have to be kind enough to guess an answer. So the first question is, so we had a specific location that was more recognizable by people outside London than Londoners themselves. Football stadium. Right. Close enough. Wow, that's the first one that I get down. fantastic. And then the second one was, there was a location that was more recognizable by people around the world than Londoners themselves.
Buckingham Palace.
Yeah, but in that case, Londoners would recognize it, right?
They might not.
Blackfriars.
Oh, yeah, well, we had this conversation yesterday. That's cheating, right? Right. So it's a location, it's palace that's been featured in different BBC series, especially in Sherlock Holmes from the 72 nowadays. So that's to tell you that the experience of the city is not only creating the physical environment. Sometimes as computer science, when we do experiments, we're obsessed about doing experiment in situ, right? So that being there. But sometimes experience is not always being there. It's learned through books and films. But so the main point of all this work is that so there was a relationship between well-being and recognizability, and now for the first time we actually established that relationship. So we have enough data to say, okay, what are the recognizability scores of different areas in London, and just relate them with the census data you have. In London, in UK, in UK, the census data is represented by this IMD, Index for Multiple Deprivation. It tells the extent to which an area is socially deprived or not. And it's a composite index, so it's an index divided in different dimensions: income, employment, health, education, housing, living environment, crime, and you can clearly see that there are certain dimensions that are more important, they are more related to recognizability than other dimensions. So for the first time, you can not only talk about abstract well-being, but you know which dimension of well-being as per census are related to the recognizability. And what we would like to do next. So I told you that the new version is different than the one I showed. So the game is always the same, is a bit prettier because I'm not being involved in the design, in the actual design of the website. So it's much better than before, design-wise. And what we like to do is we like to repeat that for different cities, right? We've done that for London, but we would like to empower other peoples. So I've been in New York, in CASP, I've been in other cities, and in Barcelona, and we are trying to actually say, okay, fantastic, you give us your city, you want to run an experiment in your city, let's say Singapore, and then we set up the website in 20 minutes, we set up the game for you, you just publicize the game among local residents, local newspapers, and you get the data. Or the recognizability. Now, as a byproduct, what we get is that we get data from different cities around the world, and we can then compare this relationship between different notions of well-being and recognizability scores. So if you would like to get involved, just please get in touch with me. And more the technical details and results are in this paper, Psychological Map 2.0. Now, with the 6 minutes left, I would like to introduce the last work, and that is kind of related to the psychological perception. And so I started with the title, and then I did the work. Because I wanted to have that title. So the title is The Shortest Path of Happiness. It's kind of a half of a joke. But the idea is that the psychological perception goes beyond recognizability and visibility. And one simple thing is what makes us, so at the end of the day, why I did that work? Because I wanted to prove a relationship with well-being, right? Whatever that means, happiness, whatever that means. And so if you think about I'm a computer scientist, so if you think about designing tools, the very, very simplest tool ever is the mapping tool and the routing tool, right? So now there you see a beautiful, fantastic map of London. So you see on the top UCL and at the bottom Tate Modern. Now you have to walk from UCL to the Tate Modern, and that is the shortest path, right? That's what mapping tools will give you. But let's assume that you were God or some sort of oracle. You would know how each street segments make you feel, right? So you know which streets make you feel happier. If you were to know that, then you could connect the points, and you could find not the shortest route, but you could find the short route that makes you happier, right? As simple as that. Now, what's the problem? We are not God, right? Yeah. So The problem is that we don't know which urban elements are actually make people happy, right? So that's a question that we were trying to answer. And that's why we built this kind of work that is titled Aesthetic Capital, what makes London look beautiful, quiet, and happy. And there has been a lot of work as well by people at UCL, neuroscientists, equipping people with brain readers and trying to walk through Soho. So there is brilliant work done in that area. But we have taken another approach, and there is again the crowdsourcing approach. And if I were to crowdsource you right now, and I were to ask you which one makes you feel happier, or which one is more beautiful, which one would you say? Picture A or picture B? Who says A? Hey. Who says B? Thank you for your cooperation. So a very subjective concept like beauty, it's in certain cases also quantifiable. And based on this premise, we actually build this website where you get 10 pairs of pictures, in this case, those they are pairs, and you have to answer a question like, which place do you find more beautiful? Which place is more quiet? Which place makes you happier? And based on these pairwise comparisons, and since you have thousands of people playing the game, then you can actually rank the picture by beauty. So you can associate a beauty score to the picture, and then you can get crazy with these beauty scores, right? Because you have pictures and beauty scores. What do? Well, one simple thing that we did, we extracted visual cues out of images. I didn't do that because I'm not a visual kind of expert guy, but we have in the labs at Yahoo where I work tons of people who do that stuff, as a daily job. And what we find out is that, so the elements that tend to be associated with happy pictures that of urban scenes that make Londoners happy, contain generally Victorian and red brick houses and public gardens. So that's what makes Londoners happy. What makes Londoners unhappy? So negative correlations, cars, right? So when you have a cars, there is a problem, but the really cool thing is that since you have tons of data, you can look at outliers. So you can look at pictures containing cars, they're still considered beautiful. Which are those cars? Cars that don't move. So cars that are parked on back streets and they're out of the way of pedestrians are totally fine. So have your car, but park it in the right spot. The second negative element is isolated buildings. That is well known from a pattern language book. I'm quoting, isolated buildings are symptoms of a disconnected sick society. There is abundant evidence to show that high buildings make people crazy. So we have been knowing that for decades, and despite that, we see a lot of this stuff. But again, you can look at outliers. So you can look at tall buildings that are considered beautiful by Londoners. And those are true exceptions. The most frequent ones are glass offices that give London its unique identity, and landmarks. Of course, if you want to know about this, I wrote the BBC article trying to understand how the future of city is going to look like, and especially related to the context of happiness and well-being. And if you really you're really interested in a topic and you want to spend a couple of days knowing everything about this, Happy City is a really nice book. It contains a lot of experiments going on individual level, macro level, about trying to understand the perception and the well-being of people in the cities. And now going back, concluded with the last minute that I have, let's go back to the map. Let's go back to UCL, and let's go back to us wanting to go to the Tate Modern through the shortest route. Maybe not. Now you understand that the solution for not being God is that you can connect the points together somehow. Yeah, so you can connect basically the pictures I show you in the games, they're geo-reference points, so they're points on a map, right? So now you have the scores for these points, and you can connect these points to find the short route, a couple of minutes longer than the shortest one, but tends to be more pleasurable. And that's what we did for London. From the very chosen point, we have the shortest route, but also the beautiful route, the quiet route, and the happy route. We have done extensive experiments as well in Boston, because in Boston we had to predict, so from Flickr metadata keywords that are used on the Flickr side, we could predict the beauty scores, for example, from these tags, and then we ran different experiments, and generally, the paths are pretty good, are pretty pleasurable, and people enjoy them. But there are three recurring elements that people mention that are missing from this kind of work. And maybe some of you have some ideas on how to address those points. So one is smell and sound. So smell and sound is something that the perception of beauty, happiness does not fully capture from this crowdsourcing work. The other one is that we are sending people through parks at night, which is not something you would like to do, especially in certain parts of the world. And the other recurring thing is that in addition to path, you associate memories. People tend to associate memories to them. What we found is that they tend to associate personal memories. Oh, this is the path, this is the street where I gave my first kiss. That's a personal memory. Or historical memories. So if you were to work around this kind of new technologies that would recreate that experience for the users around personal and shared memories, then I think you are on the right track. And I hope I took you on a research path that is happy enough for you guys. Thank you very much.